Well, good evening, everybody. I'm Dorothy Gormley. I'm president of Glasgow Archaeological Society. And I welcome you all to the fourth and final of our lecture series, our Dalrymple series for this year. I've got a couple of announcements to make and housekeeping. So I've not been advised of a fire drill or fire alarm going off. So if you do hear a fire alarm, please make your way to the exits, and as Nari pointed out yesterday, they're at the side and at the back. So please do that. In addition to co-hosting the Dalrymple lectures with Glasgow University, Glasgow Archaeological Society, also known as GAS, has a program of lectures that take place on the evening of the third Thursday in every month between October and April. Our next lecture, Viking Burial Practice in Britain and Ireland, is on Thursday the 21st of March. It's at 7:30 p.m. in the Boydore building, Glasgow University, in University Avenue. Our lectures are free and they're open to all of you. The speaker will be Dr. Stephen Harrison of Glasgow University. You'll see information about this lecture on the table outside, so please take as many flyers as you want. Take the flyer and give it to anyone. You can also visit our website, our Facebook page, and Twitter. So we're really up to date. Prior to the lecture starting, our Vice President, Kenny Brophy, wishes to say a few words about a forthcoming conference.
Thank you, Dorothy. I just wanted to say, while I have all of you here this evening, that today I've announced the date and the venue for a conference on the 5th of October, which is celebrating the life and work of Ludovic MacLellan Mann, this is the 150th anniversary of Mann's birth. And he's someone who I'm sure you're all familiar with his work in a range of different contexts. And so the conference is going to be on the 5th of October in the debating chamber in the Glasgow University Union, which is just across the road from here. And I'm putting out a kind of call for papers and contributions of anyone who wants to be involved in that. And I've already got quite a good range of speakers lined up for that event. And that event is going to be run in partnership with GAS and with the Archaeology Department of Glasgow, and also with the Student Society at Glasgow as well, and hopefully some other funders and partners will be on board in the near future. So we'll try and get something for that put onto the GAS website and also out on social media as well. And I tweeted it today, and I've already had 2 likes in the last 5 hours, so that's a real sign of the enthusiasm that Mann obviously has for people out there, but hopefully that's not a sign of things to come. So look out for more information on that, and if anyone is interested in Ludovic Mann at all, then put the 5th of October in your diary. Thank you.
I hope it's not Thursday.
No, Saturday.
Oh, good. Right. It falls to me, my job, to summarize the previous 3 lectures. It's been quite difficult because it's been so involved, and Gavin, you have told us so much that, our minds are reeling by all of that information. However, with Gavin's help, I have to say, he summarized his lectures and sent me a copy each day, although the summary was about 2, maybe 3 pages long. So I shan't be summarizing that. So I've summarized the summary. And Gavin has looked at it and approved it. So I feel quite happy. In his first lecture, The Archaeological Clock, Gavin set out to uncover the history of how a singular, unified notion of time came about. He referred to Archbishop Ussher's chronology, the use of the regnal calendars, that is, counting the years in relation to a monarch's reign, and also to the adoption of the Anno Domini system of recording, which has the fixed reference point when a fix became a single measure which replaced all others. Subsequently, the stitching together of clock time and calendrical time culminated in what we now know as the universal coordinated time. In a similar way, C4 dating enables us to compare traces of events all around the world from vastly different periods and within a single unified framework, which he calls the archaeological clock. In his second lecture, Changing Times, Gavin set out to address the problem of change in archaeology. What is it? How does our view of time affect how we comprehend it and the phasing of sites? He gave Boxgrove, a Paleolithic site in southern England, as an example of these problems, and queried the usefulness of timescales as a concept. In his third lecture, Contemporary Pasts, Gavin explored the meaning of, now I hate this word, contemporaneity, that they belong to the same time. What does this mean? He said that there are two ways of interpreting this. One is that objects are contemporary because they both date to a particular unit. The other is to say that two objects are contemporary because they both coexist during a certain time span. The difference is subtle but significant, he said. Things can be contemporary at one time but not at another. And he quoted his own situation. He said, "I coexist with my children now, but 20 years ago I did not, simply because they did not exist then." He then referred to the Hockdorf chieftain's grave, which may be dated to a specific period, but the objects and practices implicated in this burial had a temporality which exceeds a single simple date. He hoped that there is a way to preserve a historical dimension to archaeology, yet one which can acknowledge the way the past coexists with the present. Professor Gavin Lucas, this is now your fourth and final presentation to us. It is called Back to the Future. Gavin Lucas, thank you.
Thank you, Dorothy. That wonderful summing up. Yes, and as Dorothy mentioned at the end of that summing up, how can we think about historical time in a way that does justice to some of these issues about persistent pasts in the present and so on? That, in some ways, is what I really want to pick up tonight in my last lecture. Sadly, no, it's not going to be about time traveling, at least not in the conventional sense. And the future might take a while to emerge in my talk tonight, but I will get there in the end. So, a recurrent theme of my talks over the last 3 evenings has been this tension between this singularizing view of time as expressed in chronology, especially absolute chronology, and the multiplicity of time that emerges when we try and grapple with the events and processes represented in the archaeological record. Singularization is expressed through a universal timescale, infinitely extendable and scalable, at least in principle, if not in fact, limited only by our ability to provide high-resolution dating. Now, the story of this archaeological clock and its contextualization within a broader Western European conceptualization of time was something that I offered in my first lecture. Set against this in my subsequent lectures was a greater concern for addressing the multiplicity of time through the different ways in which we talk about and model change on the one hand, particularly in relation to the scale, and the issue of how the past persists into the present. Now, it would be very easy to caricature these opposing drives, that one towards singularization and the other towards multiplicity, as linked to two different traditions of time thinking, the sciences on the one hand and the humanities on the other, one dealing with an objective and physical time of the universe, and the other with a human and experienced and more subjective time. Easy, but perhaps a little bit misleading and certainly dangerous, I think. Now, there certainly is something to this opposition, but I don't think it's quite as straightforward as it might seem. So I want to begin my final lecture tonight by addressing this distinction and begin with a story that has recently become well known through the work of a particular philosopher of science. Some of you may be aware of it. The year is 1922, and Albert Einstein, who is now in his early 40s, had been invited as a guest speaker at the annual meeting of the French Philosophical Society. Inevitably, he was asked to talk about his theory of relativity, publication of which had just occurred a few years previously. Now, Einstein's fame was in the ascendant in this period, and his ideas, particularly as they pertain to time, were causing ripples of excitement across Europe and the world. But also at this meeting was Henry Bergson, now well into his 60s and the doyen of French philosophy. And Bergson did not like what Einstein had to say. After Einstein gave his lecture, Bergson stood up and offered a half-hour critique, to which Einstein replied only very briefly, but included in his reply was the very famous statement, "The time of the philosophers doesn't exist." Wow, who could take an insult like that standing? Bergson went on to write a whole book challenging Einstein, and even more to the point, or to what was worse, seems to have been instrumental in preventing Einstein from getting the Nobel Prize for his work on relativity. Instead, Einstein was given it for his work on the photoelectric effect. It's a bit like giving Darwin the prize for his work on earthworms, completely ignoring his theory of evolution by natural selection. And yet in the end, of course, Einstein became a household name and is almost synonymous with science and time and physics and genius. And Bergson, well, I'm sure a lot of us know who Bergson is, but by no means is he as famous as Einstein. So what was all the debate about? Well, quite simply, Einstein considered that time, of course, as part of a four-dimensional space-time continuum, was a property of the physical universe, measurable through clocks, though, of course, subject to variation depending on the position and the motion of the observer and the clock itself relative to any given object. Now, at its extremes, Einstein sometimes even denied time exists. He said it was just an illusion. But at least it was certainly no simple thing. So for Einstein, the time that philosophers were talking about, philosophers like Bergson, for him this was just psychology. Bergson, for his part, considered this completely upside down. Rather, it was clock time that was the poor cousin of real time, and that was the time that we experience as living beings that was far more fundamental and more important. Now, it's quite clear that in Bergson's response to Einstein, particularly as it came out in his book later, that he really misunderstood a lot of Einstein's key points, particularly about relativity. And as a result, even Bergson himself realized this later on and stopped his book from going through more editions. But the deeper differences between these two men really, in a sense, highlight a recurrent feature of discussion of time throughout the 20th century and up to today, that pits physical time against what we might call felt time, or experienced time. And yet, if we look closely at these two positions, they're not so coherent as they first appear. And here I'm going to kind of explore a little bit the way these two positions are not at all as obvious as we might think, or as opposed for that matter. Take physical time, where once it seemed like a straightforward thing, singular, as I've been talking about in my first lecture particularly, regular, forward-moving, and aloof to all the particular vicissitudes of earthly doings and goings-on. Now it's almost crumbled into nothing, in large part thanks to Einstein's theories of relativity. And here I want to draw on a very brief summary of the current state of thinking on time in physics. And I'm going to draw on the Italian physicist Carlo Rovelli, whose recent book just came out, The Order of Time, which provides a nice summary. And I'm certainly not going to pretend that I have any in-depth physical knowledge here. So the twin pillars of modern physics, relativity and quantum theory together, have in a sense pulled time apart at its seams. Time has no unity. It has a different rhythm in different places and passes slowly or quickly relative to the effects of gravity. Time literally passes more slowly on mountain peaks than on plains, even if the differences are minute. Time can dilate and contract. Because of the relativity of time to place, there's no such thing as the present. Relativity theory speaks of an extended presence, a zone within which things appear to happen at the same time, but again, always relative to an observer or an object. So for humans on Earth, for example, events on Mars which might occur and last over 15 minutes would appear only as a moment to us, observing them from that long distance. There's no way to talk about the present between any two places as belonging to the same time. So there's a nice little twist on some of the issues I was trying to address last night with contemporaneity. It simply makes no sense under relativity theory. And lastly, perhaps the most dreadful blow of all, time has no absolute direction. although we perceive it as moving in one direction from past to future, this is a product, according to quantum theory, of macroscopic blurring. Don't ask me what that means. At the microscopic level, there is no distinction between past and future. And in fact, at the quantum level, many physicists prefer to dispense with the concept of time altogether. If there's any physicists in the audience, perhaps they can clarify some of this. So, of course, one should say, I had a nice slide here. One should say that there is nonetheless some dispute amongst physicists about time, about these arguments. These arguments put forward by Ravelli are not necessarily consensual. They're perhaps the most widespread and dominant view, but not all physicists hold to them. For example, the physicist Lee Smolin recently put out a very spirited defense of time and argued that it needs to be reintegrated into physics in his book Time Reborn, rather than make time simply a variable of physics laws, like that t in those equations, which in some cases can be dispensed with. Smolin argues that the laws of physics should be themselves seen as historical and time-dependent. But I'm already, as you can probably guess, getting way out of my depth here, so I'm not going to attempt to go into this any deeper. I think it's enough to really emphasize the fact that under contemporary thinking in physics, which largely stemmed from Einstein's initial discussions, time has already lost any coherence as an independent concept. And while under quantum physics it disappears altogether, time just isn't. That's a bit of a blow for archaeology. What then of that other strand, human experiential time? Is that still there? Can we still talk about something there as in a coherent way? Well, it may not have dissolved under a loop of quantum gravity, but nor is it quite so stable and unified as it once seemed either. And here I'm going to draw, like I did with a summary in physics, I'm going to draw on the work of one German psychologist, Mark Whitman, who's given us a current update on psychological research on time in his book Felt Time. Now, in many ways, the psychology of time is characterized by an opposite tendency to in physics. It's kind of a drive to maintain coherence, a drive to kind of feel that somehow time must be some coherent underlying experience, because this is how we experience time. And the orthodox view is that humans have an internal clock, something which enables them to experience time and perceive it as a coherent phenomenon. Now, the standard model is known as SET, S-E-T, or scalar expectancy theory, which, although it was largely developed in the context of animal behavior and animal psychology, it's been largely applied also onto humans. And this model postulates three layers, which you can see on the top of this slide. So there are essentially three layers to human time perception and time consciousness. At the bottom, the most basic, is this pacemaker or clock. And I should point out quickly that there's no one's actually physiologically or biologically found what this clock is. It's merely a kind of theoretical construct, which tracks time from moment to moment. And then on top of that, there's short-term or working memory, which gathers information from the immediate experience, and then a long-term or reference memory, which stores up important information from past experience. So when our conscious decision-making processes, we're often, of course, drawing on these three scales and matching them and drawing out senses of expectation, anticipation, which work off the information gathered in short and long-term memory. Now, if we go back and examine what these three layers are involved with, particularly I'm interested in the first one, this pacemaker clock, this kind of elementary unit of temporal experience. What we're talking about here is the sense of a moment, that sense that we can experience a now that passes, that it's not a point, it's a kind of shaded continuum, but at the same time we also realize it does have edges, but we don't quite know where we put those edges. Philosophers coined some terminology for this. The most famous one is William James, the American psychologist, pragmatist philosopher, coined the term specious present to define this sense of a basic continuum. And the best way to represent what we mean by here is if you just play a note on a piano or a guitar or anything, and that note rings out, and you have that sensation of continuity, that stretching out of that now over time. And lots of other philosophers have talked about this, like Husserl as well. He talks about the now. What does this specious present involve? Well, psychological research points to this human now lasting about 3 seconds. This is, in a sense, the basic unit of time over which we have a sense of a persistent and coherent unified present. Beyond those 3 seconds, we start to enter into a different now, a different present. And this can be illustrated a number of different ways, and I've just thrown one of them up here, and this is these classic Gestalt figures, which are beloved of textbooks of theory, which like to talk about how our expectation of what we see shapes what we actually do see. So is this a duck or is this a rabbit? Well, this isn't a point to make about epistemology. I'm talking about time here. And what's interesting is that the time it takes us to switch from viewing this image from a duck to a rabbit and back again is about 3 seconds. It always takes us kind of about that length of time in which to make this Gestalt switch. But of course, even though our specious present is about 3 seconds, it doesn't mean we can't distinguish change within that period. We can have shorter perceptions of time, but it's not as a continuous present. It's more in terms of changes that take place. And in fact, our brains can perceive change at rates of up to 30 milliseconds or 40 hertz. The range is actually a little bit broader. I think it's between 20 and 60 milliseconds. But anything higher than that frequency, and our brains would simply perceive them as simultaneous. It's one of the reasons why kind of the frame rates on videos and television and cinema and stuff is about 50 hertz. And that's why motion pictures, of course, seem continuous to us, even though we know quite well that they just consist of a series of still images strung together. But when you run them together fast enough, they appear continuous to us. So even if 3 seconds is the limit for a perceptual now, we still experience time as continuous at longer stretches, though. Those movie frames that flicker at 50 hertz can take up to, those movies that we watch, where the frames flicker at 50 hertz, can take up to 2 hours to watch. And depending on the movie, of course, it can feel like still like a more or less continuous experience. And this is where the role of short-term memory comes in, stitching together those individual nows or moments for periods of in between 18 and 30 seconds and acting as a bridge to long-term memory, which ideally, of course, can last a lifetime. And I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with a lot of the research that's been done on long and short-term memory and the different pathologies that they're associated with. You know, we have very different problems with short and long-term memory that quite seem to indicate that these are two very different processes in our brains. Now, as models go, this has a lot going for it, and one can and has done all kinds of experiments which support the idea of these three different systems, the clock, short-term memory, and long-term memory. But in particular, there's very little consensus on what the physiological basis of this internal clock or pacemaker might be. And in fact, there's only one acknowledged internal clock that humans and other animals possess, and that is the circadian clock set to the 24-hour cycle, or roughly 24 hours, of course, because people vary, as we all know. Some people like to stay up late, and other of us get up early, and we all have these different rhythms. They're all slightly adjusted around this, and the consequences of these affect our behavior. But theories about the pacemaker clock are just that. They're just theories. There doesn't seem to be any physiological or agreed physiological basis in them, but at the same time, they do seem to have a link to our physiology, and that's quite evident when we think about some of the effects that can affect our time perception. And Colleen mentioned actually some of these last night in her introduction to my talk, these experience of experiencing time faster or slower depending on our mood or our particular situation. And experiments have showed that quickened breathing or quickened heart rates are correlated with experiences of time dilation or compression. Moreover, studies on time perception amongst animals seems to show a very clear correlation between metabolic rate, body size, and temporal thresholds. For example, dogs perceive change at a much higher resolution than humans, which is why dogs always seem to win those games with catch and with the balls. We can't seem to ever catch them up. They're always one step ahead of us. Yet even within these basic experiences, there's also variation. There's also distinctions in our perception of time, visually and auditory. We hear our experience of time in our auditory senses and our visual senses aren't quite always aligned, and they're mismatched, and they have slightly different thresholds as well. All of this starts to suggest that maybe this experience of time that Bergson was talking about isn't quite as unified and as simple as he first thought. And it's also not entirely clear how these three systems of pacemaker, clock, short-term memory, and long-term memory are integrated, how independent they are, how much of a coherent system they actually constitute. In other words, for many scholars, our experience of time is far more fractured than we like to suppose. Even though we feel it somehow is a coherent thing, it may in fact not be. Now, once again, I'm going way out of my depth. This is not my area of expertise, so I'm not going to push this much further. But it does seem to me that some of the implications of current research in psychology of time consciousness and time perception, both within humans and animals, is questioning this notion that time is a coherent thing, that it's not always the same thing. We're dealing with different things, different temporal aspects, and even if it seems seamless and continuous, it's anything but. But in a way, this distinction was actually already recognized by philosophers. If you read what Bergson or James or Husserl talk about when they discuss time consciousness, all of them are quite explicit on the distinction between our experience of time passing, this notion of an extended present. An extended present in this sense is not the same as the extended present in relativity theory. The distinction between that and the more conscious acts of recollection or expectation. So this shading of the past and present and future that we experience as a moving now when we hear a musical note, for example, is not at all the same temporal experience as when we're consciously remembering the past and thinking about the relationship between the past and the present and the future in conscious thought. So what can we carry away from this rather admittedly hazy and somewhat broad-brushed survey of contemporary thinking on time in physics and psychology? Well, I think for a start, it's clear that we cannot graph this opposition of singularized and multiple temporality on that between physical and felt time. Both physical and felt time are really plagued by multiplicity, and the tension, in fact, maybe between multiplicity and singularization. But also, maybe the differences between physical time and felt time are not that stark either. Time dilation is not something that just happens under different velocities and gravitational forces. It also happens in moments of extreme boredom. Life is full of experiences where our sense of time expands or contracts, depending on the nature of our experience. I know, for example, that the 4 days I've spent here in Glasgow feels a lot longer than as if I'd spent those 4 days back in my hometown in Reykjavik. And that's no reflection on Glasgow, by the way. That's just about being in a different environment and how our sense of time changes. Moreover, this distinction between present, past, and future are not just dependent on the distance between two objects in space-time, creating a variably extended present. They also depend on the ability of our brain to register changes. Just as two events separated by 10 minutes on Mars might appear simultaneous to us here on Earth, so two events separated by less than 20 milliseconds will also appear simultaneous to us. Now, these distinct, of course, talking about both of these phenomena in terms of time dilation and extended present, maybe stretching analogies and metaphors. I'm not necessarily saying they're the same thing, but at the same time, the kind of properties we're talking about in relation to time are quite clearly similar in the cases of both physical time and felt time. But whether we really insist on this dichotomy between these two notions of time or assert any underlying continuity, in either case, I think there's something very important missing from this whole picture. And this is where finally I get back to archaeology. What I think is missing is a sense of historical time. This is also where I kind of segue back into the end of my discussion from last night. The duo of physical and felt time was something that I suggested in my first lecture emerged during the early modern era, when calendrical time was unhitched from its opposition to eternity or divine timelessness in medieval conceptions and contrasted instead with individual or experienced time. Now, out of this, calendrical time morphed into a measure of physical time, especially once clock time was thrown into the mix. But what I find really interesting in this story is the fate of historical time. Calendrical time in the medieval and early modern era embraced both cosmological time and historical time. Remember, again, that notion of up until the 18th century, how Earth history was more or less considered to occupy the same time span as human history. We're talking about 6,000 years, not just for all of human history, but for the whole history of the Earth. It's only as this concept of deep time emerged that the length of time seen for the Earth and then the universe expanded to scales almost unimaginable. even though human history too was eventually recognized as much, much longer than the 6,000 years of biblical chronology, the gap between historical time and cosmological time had become massive. So my question really is, what impact did this increasing divergence have on historical time, and how did the deeper philosophical dichotomy of objective versus subjective time, or physical versus felt time, manifest itself and relate to this problem? I want to suggest that it left historical time in a bit of a limbo, or better yet, rather than in limbo, it's increasingly stretched out, with one foot in universal time and the other in human experience time. So like two continents drifting apart, history was caught in between, pulled in two opposite directions, not knowing which side to jump onto, or indeed to try and stay straddled in the middle between the two. And of course, when I'm talking about historical time, I'm including archaeological time in this. I'm using that in a very broad sense. So for Einstein floating away on the raft of cosmological time and Bergson floating on human time in the other direction, neither really paid much attention to what historical time was doing and how it had to basically try to keep itself from falling into the abyss created by this divergence between these two. Now I want to try and give some concrete examples to flesh out this dilemma faced by historical time, in case you're not fully convinced of my argument here. Most of these days, we don't blink an eye if we hear that some archaeological discovery 10,000 or 100,000 years old has been made. It certainly may be exciting, but the distance in time from where we are now doesn't particularly shock us. We're used to thinking on large scales. The age of the universe is now estimated at around 13.8 billion years, while our solar system, including the planet we call home, is thought to be about 4.5 billion years old. How do we grasp such timescales, really? I mean, seriously, how do you comprehend something that happened 4.5 billion years ago, or even a few thousand years ago for that matter? Of course, I know what it's like to think of in terms of years, even decades. I can think back to my childhood in the late 60s and 70s. I can think of my children growing up now. I suppose the older one gets, the greater one's reach. But the limit of our temporal grasp does seem to be quite constrained by the finitude of human life. But at the same time, I've excavated on sites 10,000 years old, handled artifacts more than 1 million years old. And while sometimes I get this wow factor, these are routinely timescales I don't usually feel troubled by. Why not? What's going on here? I suppose one answer would be that this deep time is a very abstract time. I comprehend it in an almost mathematical, numerical way. Those dates, 4.5 billion years, 10,000 years, they're just numerical pegs to position myself and my material, some kind of framework. My childhood from the 1970s, on the other hand, that was an experience. I lived it. It's very concrete. Now, at first, putting it this way seems to recall this opposition of physical and felt time again. And yet, when I reflect a little bit more on my childhood in the 1970s, I don't actually think of it as something that happened maybe 4 decades ago. I don't actually think of it so much in terms of linear passing at all, at least not in any quantitative way. It just was. Now, of course, I can appreciate the difference between something that happened last year and 40 years ago. But that's really in terms of some kind of vague notion of temporal distance. It's a very vague notion. And in some ways, what happened 40 years ago and 40,000 years ago, these terms, very quantitative terms, are equally strange notions and hard to grasp, except as numerical pegs. And by the same token, that wow factor I mentioned earlier, when you walk across a site built 10,000 years ago, or hold an object that was held by someone else 1 million years ago, that wow is perhaps only because of the temporal distance between now and then, but also its opposite, temporal proximity. What was then is here, now, right now, the conjunction of past and present into a single object. Now, these two cases are both, in a sense, ways of describing historical time. In one case, historical time is reduced to a chronology, a metrology. We have lots of ways to represent this, but a classic one that is often frequently used is this notion of reducing time to the scale of a 24-hour day. So, you can look at the age of the Earth on this, and typically, the first hominins arrive at whatever it is, 2 seconds to midnight, and so on. All these things kind of a way of grasping the enormity of scale that we're dealing with by compacting that scale of 4.5 billion years down into a 24-hour clock, which we can relate to. because we've never experienced 4.5 billion years, but we know what 24 hours is like. And it's this very scalability of chronology is what enables us to bridge that gap between physical time and felt time. It's this scalable function which enables us to read this sequence and convert vast scales of time exceeding hundreds of human generations into something you can experience in less than a minute. It's this scalability that taps into our lived experience and amplifies it to the nth degree so that you can accept that this is still time you're looking at. But really, what is it that makes us perceive this sequence as temporal and this one not? In the other case, historical time is reduced to a form of material memory, an experience of the past, of history as presence. And its most common occurrence for the majority of people, of course, is at a museum mediated by a glass case. And although, as archaeologists, we're privileged to experience this feeling at closer quarters, it's also a feeling we've become perhaps largely immune to. Yet the temporal properties of this experience come from a transposition of personal memory onto historical memory. We all know the experience of handling and looking at mementos, objects of which are from our own past, photographs and keepsakes and so on. But even if we have no personal recollection, when we pick up a 2-million-year-old stone tool, or a Roman amphora, or this wooden figurine, which is only a few centuries old, that same sense of the presence of the past takes place. Of course, it's not quite the same, and in fact, that very sense of wonder and awe probably derives from the fact that we don't have any personal recollection, even though it seems to somehow evoke, however faintly, the same temporal feeling of when we do. It's a bit like an unfamiliar memory, an uncanny past, if you were to put it in Freudian terms. Both chronology and historical presence, then, are surely vital ways to capture historical time. But I think they're also very much caught up in this opposition I have previously elaborated, that between physical and felt time. I feel they're also somewhat limited, a very limited capacity there for engaging with historical time because of they're caught up in this tension. If we take historical time as chronology, this of course is great for ordering events and objects in a sequence, and I don't doubt for a moment its inherently essential role it plays in archaeology. But chronology in itself doesn't really give us history, merely its empty shell. I mentioned Hayden White's discussion of the medieval annals in my first lecture. And one of his key points in that paper was that the annals and even simple chronicles don't amount to history because they lack one key factor, narrative. Johann Fabian, in his classic text on time in anthropology, which I mentioned also last night, also talked about this. His historical account of the development of deep time in the 19th century highlighted what he called the naturalization of time. It's the same thing, this kind of purification of time of any meaning, its reduction to a simple metric, a simple kind of chronology. And once you do that, of course, you need to fill that void. Time then becomes empty, so you need to fill it with meaning. White would have called the need for a narrative. And it's this drive to fill this void left by the production of chronology that led 19th century anthropologists and archaeologists to develop those social evolutionary narratives. Now, of course, we have other ways of filling that void, but they're still, in a sense, done intentionally in opposition to that purification of time created by chronology. With historical time as presence, the problem is rather different, and in fact, in some ways, maybe even more insidious. That experience of the past and the present seems replete with meaning. There's no void there. And in fact, you know, or if you read Laurent Olivier on this, when he's talking about archaeology as memory in some way, one is kind of captured and spellbound by this vision of archaeology grounded in a form of memory work. And yet, sometimes in my most skeptical moments, I wonder if this isn't a gilded cage. It looks nice, it feels good, but where does it take us? For it to keep its potency alive, it needs to keep us trapped in that moment of wonder, that feeling of co-presence. Just as chronology reduces historical time to an empty, meaningless chronicle, so co-presence reduces historical time to a compacted, emotionally charged moment. And neither, in the end, perhaps really do historical time any service or justice. So what can we do? Well, one possibility lies in recognizing that what has been a source of anxiety for archaeology and history may actually turn out to be a source of strength. Maybe it's through history that some form of reconciliation is possible, that our choices aren't confined to which side of the divide to jump, physical time or felt time. But we have a third option, to heal this rift, to use our in-between position to mediate. And now I'm going to get a bit nostalgic, because this was a position taken by the philosopher Paul Ricoeur, who saw in narrative the redemptive power of history to heal the fracture between physical time and felt time, or as he described them, cosmological and phenomenological time. Maybe it's because I was reading Paul Ricoeur at a very formative part of my intellectual development when I was doing my PhD that I kept this soft spot for him. But I do feel that what he's saying resonates a lot for me and has attracted me ever since I engaged with his work in the 90s. And Paul Ricoeur, as I was talking to Ken earlier, was very popular at the time, but no one ever mentions his name these days. And I think it's important, though, to make a distinction here between talking about time and evoking it. Now, the last 3 nights, I've been talking an awful lot about time, but I've not really evoked it. Or maybe I have, but only accidentally, perhaps. But I think it's this notion of the evocation of time that is really what this question of narrative is all about. It's not about thinking about social memory in the past or past people's time consciousness. These, of course, are important ways of thinking about time in archaeology. But in terms of what I'm talking about, this notion of historical time and trying to create a proper sense of historical time, this is something we have to approach obliquely, not kind of explicitly. We have to evoke time through our practices rather than necessarily represent them or come on full front. Now, I think a lot of archaeologists have actually tried to do this, particularly many of those people working in notions of the archaeology of the contemporary past and focusing on the presencing of the past that I talked about last night. They precisely try and elicit this sense through their writing, or particularly through other forms, because often people feel writing is not the best way to express some of these things. There's been a lot of interesting work in expressing temporality through visual and performative media instead. But I'm a quite traditionalist when it comes to these things. I always like to think about writing and text, maybe also because I've just finished writing a book about writing in archaeology. But to me, the power of writing and narrative can't be forgotten in this, because it is still a really important part of what we do as archaeologists and a way of communicating what we do. And it's not to downplay some of these performative and visual medias. These are still vital, important ways, but I think we can't forget the power of text. What we need to do, in a sense, is reanimate the power of text to do some of these other things which people are trying to do with these other media. There's been a lot written about in narrative in archaeology, not so much about its connection to time. Of course, you get some rather banal observations that the linearity of narrative somehow evokes the linearity of time, that the sequence of our text follows the sequence of chronology. But most discussions of narrative focused on other issues of epistemology, issues of fact and fiction, and so on. But Ricoeur is interesting because the question of time was always central to his discussion of narrative. And his work is really, I think, an important way to start rethinking about this process. But at the same time, his work takes us in a particular direction which doesn't really fit with the way I want to take things tonight. So I'm going to leave Ricoeur to one side for the moment and think about this problem of time and narrative through the work of another theorist. The Russian literary theorist Mikhail Bakhtin and his concept of the chronotype. Bakhtin used this term to refer to the way narratives construct senses of time and space. Again, it's this notion of evoking time obliquely rather than necessarily talking about it or representing it. It's how time is evoked through the construction of narrative itself. Now, Bakhtin's work became well known in the West after the 1960s, was taken up by many archaeologists in the 1990s. Again, the 1990s was a period for a lot of interest in narrative and so on, so it's no surprise. One of the best works to come out of this genre was Rosemary Joyce's book on the languages of archaeology, where she discusses Bakhtin a lot, particularly draws on Bakhtin's notions of chronotypes, talking about chronotypes in archaeology, such as the chronotype of progress and chronotype of discovery, how these kind of narrative forms or structures evoke a certain temporality in the way they write about the past or write about archaeology. Bakhtin's own discussion of chronotypes was somewhat general, but other scholars have started to kind of adapt a more analytical approach and break this down. And here I just want to particularly mention the work of Bart Koonin, whose book Time and Imagination develops Bakhtin's notions of chronotypes in a more systematic way than Bakhtin did. Koonin suggests that Western writing has essentially operated under two main chronotypes, what he calls the monological and the dialogical. The former are characterized by this singular sequence that ends in a final resolution, what he calls the eschaton or telos. And this, of course, in a sense, is the classic European narrative, the classic novel. It kind of unfolds a series of events, but we expect the novel to have a final resolution, a denouement, an ending, this feeling of satisfying that the story has come to an end. And this is in some sense, one of the most classic and traditional genres of at least European narrative. The dialogical chronotype is something slightly different. It has a much less attention to kind of where the story is going to go and end, but focuses much more on time as a conjunction of events, which deals with issues of this Greek notion of kairos that I talked about in my first lecture again, this notion of timeliness, a sense of timing, events happening at the right or wrong time. Now, I'm no literary theorist, and I'm certainly not going to attempt to kind of impose this classification on archaeological writing or even develop my own sense of archaeological chronotypes. But I do want to just draw vaguely on this work and suggest two different ways in which archaeologists might use the narrative, the concept of the chronotype, and the concept of narrative particularly, to construct a sense of historical time. I've put up here some of these kind of archaeological historical chronotypes, and of course we've got the traditional one at the top, this notion of just simply what happened in the past, and this notion that our narratives are simply about relating a set of events. This is the way things happened. But I want to just address and raise up two other possible chronotypes out of, I'm sure, hundreds we could think about if we were creative enough. And one is, I called here counterfactual chronotypes, and the other is futural chronotypes. The first one deals with what you might call modal time, the time of what might have been or could have been. We can call this a kind of counterfactual archaeology, but that term I does fear carry a lot of baggage, which will become clear in a second. The other idea, this kind of futural chronotype, is more about the idea of unfinished time, of a past which is not yet over, incomplete. Now, both of these chronotypes actually work better as kind of tense dualities between what was and what could have been, or between what is over and done with and what is not yet finished. I think it's helpful to kind of flesh these ideas out through a very concrete and easy to understand example. I don't know if anyone has read this book. I read it recently. I thought it was really good fun. 7 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle by Stuart Turton. It's a kind of murder mystery set in a stately home, like an Agatha Christie novel, except one with a real twist. It's a kind of Rashomon meets Groundhog Day. You'll see why in a second. I don't want to ruin the plot in case you haven't read it and want to read it, but basically the book's main protagonist is made to relive the same day over and over again, but each day inhabiting the body of a different character. And he has basically 8 days or 7 days in which to solve a mystery, a murder mystery. And if he doesn't complete that within those 7 days, his memory is erased and he starts all over again. Now, it's a great example of what I mean by evoking time. This book doesn't talk about time, but it evokes senses of time through its narrative construction. And I think it basically illustrates both of these types I was talking about, modal time and futural time. The endless cycle of 7 days and 7 lives suggests a story that may have gone on for a long time. We don't know how long the character has had to relive these 7 days over and over again. And we certainly don't know when we're reading the book if he's actually going to finish it, or even if it will finish. Each cycle is also a play on this notion of counterfactual histories, a subtle variation of the one before. And in a sense, reliving the 7 days over and over again, it's like trying it out, a subtle variation of the one before to get the right events which will lead to the mystery being solved. It's a bit like someone running through a series of computer simulations, tweaking the variables here and there. And it seems like getting just the right combination is vital to finding the right solution, making sure the right characters are in the right place at the right moment. Timing is essential. So I think, in a kind of really simplistic way, this kind of expresses what I'm talking about in terms of modal time and futural time, this sense of incompleteness and also what might have been. I want to now just to take these ideas and explore how they might operate in the context of archaeological narratives. So the first one I want to discuss relates to this notion of modality of time, what might have been. Now, I guess most of us would like to think that archaeology tries to get at what happened in the past. Now, I realize that we could go on talking about what I mean by that all night. Even if, of course, we can never be sure it was like this, or that our image of the past will change, and of course that we recognize that our stories of the past are just interpretations, there's still a presumption that there is some sense of objectivity or reality out there which we are attempting to get at. And when we imagine an alternative past, though, it's not in the sense of an alternative interpretation. It's rather an assumption about an alternative way things could have been. It's a recognition that things might have turned out differently. Okay, this is where we get to counterfactual histories. And these, of course, are a very common genre, particularly amongst historians. You don't really see archaeologists dealing with counterfactual archaeology very often, if at all. And I think it's partly because of the nature of the things that we are dealing with. Historians deal more with the kind of events that lend themselves to counterfactual histories, key turning points which might turn around military or political events or the existence of individuals. You know, what if JFK had never been assassinated? What if Hitler had never been born? You can play all these games, but archaeology, it doesn't really work like that. What if this pit never existed? Oh, so what? You know, it doesn't. The senses of counterfactuals don't always have the same purchase in archaeology as they do in history. Now, there's been some interest in this genre in history, but on the whole, most historians have been fairly negative to counterfactual history. The historian E.H. Carr called them parlor games, while another famous historian, E.P. Thompson, was less diplomatic, calling them unhistorical shit. Forgive my language. I don't really have time to get into the intricacies of some of these studies. I've thrown up two recent-ish books that deal with this subject in history. But I really want to think about how this might apply to archaeology. And I think I really want to use not the term counterfactual, because of all the baggage this carries with them, but rather suggest the notion of virtual archaeologies. And here I'm drawing quite explicitly on the philosophy of Michael Delander. Some of you may be familiar with his work. Let's think about this in terms of an example. Think of it this way. We have a suite of material culture from the early Neolithic in Britain. And one way of expressing this is this suite of material culture actualizes various kind of dispositions or capacities in its interaction with other objects. For example, let's just spell this out. A flint knife may have been used for cutting rope, meat, possibly even human flesh. We don't know, maybe in some situations. But we can be pretty sure it was never used for cutting paper because paper didn't exist in any relation to this knife. But at the same time, we pick up that flint knife today and we can cut paper with it. So the knife has the capacity and the potential to cut paper. It's just a capacity that hasn't been actualized. It remains latent, unactualized, virtual, we can call it, in this Deleuzian language that Delander uses. Now, to use the idea of the virtual as a means of inscribing a sense of what might have been into the past, in a sense, what I'm suggesting is that we should attend to those capacities which have been actualized and compare them with those which haven't, the things that could have been based on what we know of the material conditions of the time. In other words, what I'm suggesting is that maybe we can situate the actual early Neolithic, and by actual I mean as we currently understand it, within a virtual early Neolithic. And it's this juxtaposition of the two that generates this contingency we're looking for, this sense of what might have been, this modality of time. And this is actually something that the archaeologist Ollie Harris has also recently suggested. He doesn't use quite the same language I have, but he does express it in a very similar way in relation to ontologies and issues of variation during the Neolithic. So I'm not the only one who's that far out there. At the same time, I think I'm a little ambivalent about this kind of approach and the usefulness of an archaeology of a virtual past. It's a bit like this philosophical thesis of possible worlds. It may be one way of dealing with this issue of historical modality, but perhaps we don't really need to go that hard. If we can change the tense from what might have been to simply what might be, then perhaps that's enough. Or to put it another way, to write archaeologies as if we didn't know how the story is going to end. And here, really, what I'm talking about is incorporating a sense of futurity into the past. Characterizing it like this then leads me naturally onto this second chronotype I talked about, futural chronotypes, this sense of unfinished or incomplete pasts. This coupling of the past with a concept of closure or ending, there's nothing particularly new in that. Many archaeologists have discussed this before again. And have critiqued this very point. But most of the kind of basis of that critique or the rationale behind it has been linked to kind of this postmodern issue of keeping the past open to interpretation. Of course, the past isn't closed because every new generation can reinterpret it in its own way. Every generation constitutes its own past, and so on. Now, that may well be the case, but I'm more interested in this idea and this notion of a past which is literally unfinished or incomplete, rather than a past which is just epistemologically plastic or malleable. Let's take an example like the Neolithic Revolution. We tend to think of that as in the past. It happened thousands of years ago. But in a way, of course, we're still living with its consequences. And this is something, again, I touched on last night, particularly in the discussion, this idea of the animacy or agency of the past. We're still living the consequences of this Neolithic revolution. Our reliance on domesticated plants and animals, our whole way of life is in many ways still deeply affected by those events that happened thousands of years ago. It's even ingrained into our biology through tolerance of lactose, at least for some of us. So can we really say that the past, any past, is over and done with? And how might we characterize a finished past anyway? But at the same time, this notion of something being unfinished is equally troubling. If nothing else, it seems to imply the possibility of completion. If we imagine the past as unfinished, then by implication, its completion must still lie in the future. In this way, our pasts and futures are more connected than we usually acknowledge. And now, finally, I get to the relevance of my title. A future hasn't traditionally figured much in the discipline of archaeology, at least not explicitly. And after all, it might seem strange that it should. I mean, archaeology surely is concerned with the past, not the future. But if we seriously reflect on this notion of unfinished pasts, then we cannot but also have to think about the future and the relationship between the two. Now, this, in some ways, was the key insights of the German historian Reinhard Koselleck, who saw the importance of making historical consciousness not just about the past-present relation, but also the future. Now, Koselleck was writing very much under the influence of German philosophers, hermeneutic philosophers, Heidegger and Gadamer, so a lot of his ideas are coming from there, and he uses these meta-historical concepts called the space of experience and the horizon of expectation to articulate this notion and this notion of historical consciousness as being about both the present, past, and the future. Helps if I can just situate this by bringing us back to this archaeological example and the emergence of deep time in the 19th century. This recognition and the antiquity of humankind was not 6,000 years, but hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years old, did mark a momentous change in historical consciousness and ultimately inaugurated the discipline of prehistory. Again, as I touched on this in my first lecture and several lectures over the last few nights. But this development was deep history was really the tail end of an expansion of deep time for the Earth and the universe, which began to be proposed widely amongst scholars, especially from the later 18th century. Suddenly, there was a past which seemed to be vast and stretched further back than any human memory, a past which seemed very remote and disconnected from the present. Now, I don't think it's any coincidence that the concept of a deep past emerged at the same time as the concept of a deep future. And this is precisely Koselleck's point. He argued that the 18th century ushered in a new historical consciousness, one that disconnected the present from the past and connected it much more closely to the future. And the expansion of time was very much connected to this, especially in its relationship to the future. Let me try and explain this in some diagrams. So what Koselleck is suggesting is that prior medieval historical consciousness or time consciousness operated under the idea that the past provided a relatively good guide to the present, where present experience, or the space of experience as he called it, dominated notions of history. This is the idea that basically if you wanted to know how to act and behave today, you could look to what happened in the past and use that as a guide. So looking into history was a guide to present action and even determining what kind of future actions you'll take. And this is why a lot of medieval history, if we want to use that word history, followed the typical mode of a kind of moral lesson. History is the teacher of life. The future, on the other hand, was kind of enveloped within this notion, was largely subordinate to the weight of the past. The future was essentially finite. And this is very clear under kind of Christian eschatologies, where even if you didn't know when the Day of Judgment was going to happen, you knew it was going to happen. You knew that there was a point when history was going to come to end. History was going to end one day, even if we weren't sure when that was going to happen. Same with our own lives. We don't know when we're going to die, but there's one thing we're sure of: we are going to die. Now, what Koselleck suggests is starting in the 16th century, but culminating in the 18th century, a new historical consciousness took shape, one dominated no longer by the space of experience, this sense of connecting the past and the present together, but rather by what he calls the horizon of expectation, one where the present got much more coupled with the notion of future, and the past now became something floating and separate. The past was no longer a guide to present actions, and the future suddenly opened out and became limitless. Suddenly, there was no end of the world. We didn't know when the world was going to end. In this kind of secular notion of history and the future, things have been completely changed and turned upside down. And of course, linked to this is the emergence of new tropes of history, one which look to the future, the most obvious one being this trope of progress, this kind of endless cycle of improvement. Now, for Koselleck, the key kind of moment when all these things came together and crystallized so that you knew for sure we were now in this new phase of temporal consciousness was the French Revolution. It kind of marked this decisive moment in this modern notion of historical consciousness. It was an open future where anything was possible. And it seems to me we really cannot understand or recognize the acknowledgement of deep time, which emerged at exactly the same time as this notion of a deep, open future. The two are, I think, very intimately connected. So the question really is, what I'm saying is what's at stake here is that our accounts of the past are really intrinsically connected to the future. Now, archaeology and indeed history conventionally see their role as understanding the past, sometimes with a nod to its relevance in the present, hopefully more than just sometimes. But at most we've focused on this past-present relationship, but in doing so, of course, we've forgotten that missing third tense, the future. And this is more than just acknowledging the contemporary social or political context of archaeology. It's more than just seeing the past as being inflected by present concerns. It's rather about seeing what visions of the future our stories of the past implicitly or explicitly make possible or imaginable. In the past decade, there's actually been an increasing interest in the future amongst archaeologists from all kinds of angles. I'm not going to try and review them all here, but quite a few of them come close to what I'm trying to talk about here. One in particular I just mentioned is the Heritage Futures Project, run with Rodney Harrison and Cornelius Holtorf, who are kind of thinking about the notion of heritage as a future assembling practice, rather than something that's concerned with the past. Such a concern for the future is especially acute today, because perhaps we actually no longer inhabit Koselleck's 18th century notion of historical consciousness, one that saw the future as rosy and pink, a story of progress, an almost infinite perfectibility of humanity. Now, of course, even at the time, such narratives were always tempered by the opposite. But I guess the question is, or the issue is, that the notion of future today is taking into a completely different realm. It's not about whether it's good or bad, rosy or not. It's perhaps more about what kind of future is unimaginable at all. And here I want to kind of bring my talk to an end by bringing in the French historian François Hartog, whose work on regimes of historicity, in a sense, very much takes inspiration from Koselleck's work, but attempts to bring it up to date, at least in his own particular style. Hartog's thesis is that our contemporary historical or temporal consciousness is structured by an all-enveloping present, whereby the past and future have both become simultaneously indistinguishable from, and yet at the same time radically alien to the present. And he calls this condition presentism. Symptoms of this particular regime of historicity are easy to spot in the way the past and future are conceptualized and articulated in cultural practices. I'm going to give some examples just to clarify here what he's talking about by presentism. One is the current obsession with heritage, where the past is argued to take the form of what, as was initially put forward by Halbwachs and later Pierre and Nora, dead memories. Or Nora talks about them, of course, as lieux de mémoire, sites of memory. Both of these concepts are really taken to have no connection to living forms of memory, that is, memories which are embedded in everyday practice. They are histories with no real or substantial connection to our lives, but exist as a focus of intellectual engagement or a fun day out, and stand very much in contrast to living memories, which are largely localized to families or small communities and are embedded in daily routines. But what both Nora and Hartog are suggesting is that society as a whole today essentially has no living memory. Indeed, dead memory is actually becoming institutionalized, particularly through things like academic disciplines like history and archaeology, and it's the clearest sign of the deadness of memory from their point of view. So this concept of dead memory captures the duality I mentioned earlier, insofar as both the past is both indistinguishable and yet radically alien from the present. So a heritage site, just take one for example like Stonehenge, exists here and now. All its meanings and uses are bundled in contemporary concerns and interpretations. Yet at the same time, we acknowledge its historicity, its age, not least through archaeological narratives. But as the past, as a form of history, Stonehenge remains almost like a completely different world to our everyday lives. It's like a parallel world, only one that existed long ago. Now, of course, we can build bridges between these worlds, the adoption of a single chronology, or this kind of sense of co-presence, of walking around Stonehenge and feel that connection. But we're coming back to those same issues of collapsing historical time into these two forms of felt time or physical time again. And the very fact that we build these bridges or attempt these bridges, in a sense, only highlights the underlying chasm that separates us. What Hartog is arguing is that the rise of the heritage industry in the late 20th century tells of an increasing concern for recovering and remembering a past which we're afraid to forget or even acknowledge that we've already forgotten. What they're suggesting, ironically, is that the more the past is visible in contemporary culture, whether it's through archaeological sites or the number of antiques roadshows and flog it episodes on television, the more it reveals an underlying anxiety about our disconnection from the past. Now, what applies to the past also applies to the relationship between the future and the present. The same schisms are evident there too, where the future is both simultaneously indistinguishable from the present and yet radically other, alien. The future is here already. This was an argument put forward by Alvin Toffler in his 1970 book, Future Shock. And here he's referring to the effect of technological revolutions entering society, especially the information technology. For Toffler, a classic sign of the conflation of present and future is the accelerating nature of change, technological change. New technologies, new fashions come so fast that the old and new exist side by side. Now, when Toffler was writing in the 70s, such juxtapositions produced what he called future shock. Today, I don't think we have any sense of temporal displacement at all. That notion of future shock just doesn't exist, which perhaps even just reinforces Hartog's point. The next generation of iPhone or microprocessor is coming, it's here, it's been superseded, all within the blink of an eye. The only thing you can be sure of is that if the future is here already, it will be unevenly distributed. Who has the new iPhone first? Who can afford the future now, and who has to wait for the future? The future itself then becomes a currency, and quite literally, of course, in the case of stock markets and trades and financial futures and hedge funds. But just as the future is already here, so it's also totally alienated from the present, in the sense that what the future will be like is to some extent unimaginable. Now, with that I don't mean we can't conjure up stories of the future. In fact, our contemporary narratives, particularly in movies and television, are filled with narratives of the future, science fiction. It's a constant stream of stories which play out these imagined futures for us. But the problem is, as you're probably aware, they're all exactly very similar. All our imagined futures, in a sense, can't think outside the zone of the present. The future simply is either an indefinite extension of the present, or it marks the end of the present. Just full stop, point, the end of human civilization. Our most popular futures are either extensions of current technologies like artificial intelligence or space travel, or near total obliteration through war or asteroids, or best of all, ones that combine both, apocalypse through AI, the rise of the machines. It's another nostalgia trip for me, I'm sorry. The closure of the future, of our imagined future, was basically the message of Francis Fukuyama's widely read and cited book and paper, The End of History. The end of history doesn't refer to the end of events in time, but the end of any new forms of society. In its most succinct expression, it's the inability to conceive of any other social order after capitalism. With capitalism, humanity has reached its final destination. The collapse of the Berlin Wall, of communism, and the Soviet Union marked for many the end of any real viable alternative to capitalism. The future has no shape other than capitalism, except apocalyptic self-destruction through capitalism itself, which is perhaps, after all, what part of the politics of global warming and narrative of global warming is about. So surrounding and lying between dead history and the end of history is the present. Now, Hartog presents us, of course, with a very gloomy narrative, and he's himself somewhat ambivalent about whether these are symptoms of a new regime of historicity or simply kind of transitional birth pangs of some new form of consciousness yet to emerge. And I'm myself troubled by this narrative as well. I'm not sure what I think about it. But at the same time, I've spent a lot of time talking about it because I think what it underlies really is the crucial point in all this. That once we appreciate that our sense of history, our sense of the past, is fundamentally connected to our sense of the future, we cannot really divorce the two. We have to prepare for the fact that these contemporary tremors marking archaeologists' interest in the future also foretell potentially new conceptions of the past. It suggests that the stories of the past that archaeology gives us need to be much more conscious of how they're going to shape our imagined futures. Thank you.
Madam President, colleagues, fellow GAS members and friends, as both a lecturer in archaeology at Glasgow University and a council member of Glasgow Archaeological Society, and so with a foot, as it were, in both camps, I am particularly honoured to have been invited to propose a vote of thanks for Professor Lucas. Given the chronological range, in every sense, of his presentations this week, I am also slightly apprehensive. A vote of thanks usually includes a summary of what has been said, and given the range, extent, and complexity of what has been discussed in this theatre, I am wearying of giving a vote so long that it causes problems for future absolute dating or rivals Bergsman's response to Einstein. But then, one of the things about the Dalrymple series is time, with 4 evenings and 4 hours to explore a theme or series of closely related themes. The series provides an opportunity to expand and develop ideas and to pursue concepts, which is increasingly rare in an academic culture of presentations that holds 30 minutes to be a long conference paper and promotes the 5-minute PhD as something more than a novelty. Given the time allowed by the Dalrymple format, it is perhaps appropriate that Professor Lucas has focused on the archaeology of time. Time is, of course, a fundamental concern of archaeology, and indeed history, and has been from the origins of both disciplines. All 4 lectures have demonstrated this, but have worked to tease apart many preconceptions and indeed misconceptions. Unlike our president, I did not check with our speaker about my summaries, but so I will make the pronouncement that sort of any errors are, of course, entirely mine. On Monday, we heard an exploration of the archaeological clock, which covered a wide range of issues, not least the relationship between relative and absolute chronologies. This relationship is frequently taught and thought of as a kind of insert tab A into slot B, often with a note, some force may be necessary. And it struck me, at least, as interesting to think, at the very least, as interesting to think of the 2 systems in terms of change, the speciality, as it were, of relative chronologies, and duration, largely the preserve of absolute systems. Changing ways of thinking about time also formed a key part of this presentation as we move towards a conclusion that emphasized steady progress towards the singularization of time. Professor Lucas returned to ideas of change and continuity in his second lecture on changing times. Again, as a lowly medievalist, I have to admit to not having given serious thought to the extent to which the 3-age system could, or perhaps more accurately could not, be applied outside Northern Europe, or to some of the varied issues associated with applying deep history or big history to the archaeological record. We heard about issues of relative scale that stretched from early modern Skálholt to the deep prehistory of Boxgrove, in a presentation that culminated in the presentation of an ambitious model of events, conjunctures, and structures that applies a not quite Bradelian model to the archaeological record as a whole. Yesterday, on Wednesday, we heard about contemporary pasts, a term that is frequently applied to ideas of the past in the present, as demonstrated by the discussion. Professor Lucas, however, focused on the idea of contemporaneity and the many issues associated with phasing, or perhaps more specifically, disentangling some of the complexities that are often hidden by phasing. He demonstrated that few, if any, archaeological records fulfill the Pompeii premise. They are not moments in time, but palimpsests of different moments, even palimpsests of different palimpsests in some models. from death to burial in the Iron Age, or in the lingering influence of structures and forms in Olivier's polychronic ensemble in modern streetscapes. Tonight, in Back to the Future, we have explored time itself and the potential breakdown of both scientific and human times. We have talked about the problem of historical time, pulled apart from cosmological and lived time, and to some extent seen how this may be bridged by temporal proximity of artifacts, though this is also problematic. He's also demonstrated the need for narrative, and so having, in the beginning of the lecture, almost put archaeologists out of a job, given us something to do again, though, of course, we then moved on to ideas of counterfactual archaeology and issues of narrative itself. It is appropriate, therefore, that we have finished with the idea of the archaeology of futures and the idea of archaeology in the future. As I said at the beginning, time is central to archaeological thought. Ironically, it is so central that it is very rarely examined as a thing in and of itself. Professor Lucas, it has been a pleasure to hear you explore some aspects of the archaeology of time, and through your presentations to reconsider it as a phenomenon. Geographically, you have ranged from Iceland to southern Germany, chronologically from the deep past to the deep present, and indeed perhaps the deep future, and intellectually from archaeology to history, sociology, physics, literature, and philosophy. At the invitation of the Dalrymple Lecture Committee, and on behalf of both Glasgow Archaeological Society and Archaeology at Glasgow University, I would like to propose a vote of thanks for a fascinating series of lectures.
I don't know if I'm supposed to say anything, but I would just like to express my deep thanks for the invitation. And it's been an honor and a great pleasure to be here for these 4 nights. And I just had a tremendous time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.